our next presentation will be by Professor Robert Katzschmann. He is an assistant professor of robotics and head of ETH Social Robotics Lab. His research group advances robots' abilities for real-life applications by being more compliant and adapting better to the environment. Welcome, Professor. Please start when you're ready.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. I hope you can see my screen. I will be telling you today about how we in our group are creating and controlling soft robots, and we are targeting applications that are both in the fields of manipulation but also locomotion. And here on this first slide, I'll just give you a little bit of a short taste of the types of systems we've been looking into in the past, and I will also have a couple of more interesting systems I will be showing to you. So just a brief background to give you an understanding of how did I come to this point. Well, so I previously was a systems engineer at Auris Health, and there I first got introduced into how to do medical systems, primarily surgery robots. And so it got me an exposure to the idea of taking devices that could be used as endoscopes or other sort of devices that can go into anatomical lumens. And from that point, I moved to do a PhD at MIT, and there was my focus on soft robots. I then worked at Emerson Robotics as an applied scientist. And after this, and while I was at Emerson, I was focused on manipulation. And then I focused at a startup as a CTO to do food robot manipulation. So this is my background. But let's go into the motivation of my research. So for my work, I've primarily been inspired by nature, as many have been, but what inspires me particularly is the continuous deformation that is used in the survival of creatures. So here you see a fish that's swimming against the stream. It's very capable of going against the stream. There's one caveat: the fish is dead, it's not alive. And so you see how this fish is swimming up the stream against the flow, but it's actually not doing that willingly because it was killed just before this video. And similarly, you can look at creatures such as an octopus, or you can look at elephants, and they also use deformation, continuous deformations of their tentacles or of their trunks, respectively. And they use that to basically manipulate the world and go around and feel out the world. So the octopus is using its tentacles to capture its prey, and the elephant is using it to conform to the environment and find food. So you see, animals are quite flexible. They are very adaptive to the environment, and particularly these creatures with these muscular hydrostats, they're quite adaptive, and they're also very efficient. They don't use the same amount of energy as we use with our robots these days. So how can we reproduce such built-in intelligence and while being dexterous and safe with our robots? So a lot of research in the field of soft robotics has been focused on mechanisms that can work underwater, or they can be crawlers, they can be arms, or it can be grippers. And so the next generation of these robots are to take them to another level, to say, can we build systems that are fully integrated using these actuation mechanisms, apply controls to them to really move them in the way that we want them to behave and move around, and then apply learning algorithms on top of this to actually give us in the end eventual goals. So like eventually our goal should be, at least in the short term, to build more biomimetic locomotion systems, flexible manipulation systems, but also to recreate intelligent behaviors, such as you see them, for example, with an octopus. You can take a young octopus and trap it for its very first time into a container. Like here, you see this glass container with red lids, and then the octopus is capable of escaping by just figuring out that it needs to be lifting that lid. So that is quite a unique behavior that they can learn by themselves. So how do you reproduce this? This is really the questions that I'm interested in to achieve locomotion, manipulation, and these behaviors. So in this talk today, I will be telling you very briefly a bit about how we are making single soft actuators, and then how do we use them for integrated systems, and then I will be speaking about modeling and control. So to get started, so how do you create a soft robot? So you start off with a design for these soft actuators, and I won't get into much details of how you make them. You can look up by now many different papers in the field that describe to you the different designs of soft actuated robots. But here's an example. This is a fishtail that has two chambers that can be pressurized. You pressurize it with liquid, and that causes the structure to deform. And then you need to decide of what fabrication approach you're going to be using. Are you going to be casting, 3D printing, or using another method for making these robots? And then in the end, you need to choose a source of pressurization, like a power source that provides the forcing to the structure. And so from this, you then have to go testing, and then you repeat this cycle over and over until you actually have a functional soft robot that can actually do what you want it to do. So with this being said, let's see what we can make with this. With this approach, we can, for example, build a soft robotic fish. That was one of the things I've done for my PhD, which was this underwater fish robot that's using this tail. And it's a structure that you can then deploy in the ocean to let it swim. And the goal was to build a system that we could use as humans deploying it in the ocean to do biomimetic locomotion, so have something swim like a real fish, and see how we could use this as a spying device that could observe marine life. So here's Sophie, which is the underwater exploring robotic fish that is capable of swimming in the ocean and can look into its surrounding environment and look at what's going on. And as you see, Sophie is swimming across the waters, and it's just looking at its surrounding species, and it's filming continuously, while there are divers a couple of meters behind sending it communication and telling it what to do. So the system is essentially a combination of a soft actuator and a rigid structure. So you're combining both the silicone tail that's shown here in green. The green tail has additionally a built-in fin that goes through this tail. And additionally, on the other side, you have these buoyancy control units, the pump and the dive planes, and also electronics that you need to communicate with it. So there's an acoustic modem on board. And we're using this acoustic modem to then have on the other end, the diver is holding a device, which is a diver interface module. And this device can talk to the fish and tell it what's going on. So here you see we have this device broken up that is capable of going underwater. It's filled with oil, so this allows this to be portable and with the diver. And so we are able to we took Sophie into the ocean, and we tried this out in multiple coral reefs, and we tried communicating to it, and that all worked, and we were able to send it commands and to tell it where to go. And then we had it navigate over the various coral reefs. Here's an example of it going over the cabbage patch, which was one of the coral reefs that we were diving at. And in the end, we could use Sophie to basically get close up to other species and film them and observe them and learn from them. But one thing that was limiting to all of this was that all of this work required manual design to come up with this soft robot, with this creature. And there was only limited autonomy to the system because, I mean, it was able to swim and it were able to tell it commands, but Sophie would not have been able to survive by itself down there in the ocean if there wouldn't have been a diver that every once in a while could help it out. So that being said, that got us to one of the interesting topics that we are focused on is how do you actually model these robots? Like you can build them, we can show that they work, but how do you actually deal with these systems if you're having not just one, but multiple of these actuators, and you bring them into series, you bring them together, and then you want to show that you can build something controlled and a learning application. So if we're speaking about controls in my group, and about modeling in particular, modeling for controls, we are looking at 4 different approaches that we have been looking at so far. One of them is using a differential projective dynamics approach, which is a finite element method that we are using to fairly quickly, with an implicit Newton-Euler method, forward simulate what is going on with a fully deformable structure, such as these fish that you see here. And I will talk about this in a second, how this works. The other method we're using is minimal parameter models, where we are just making a very strong simplifications about the structure, and then we're using an augmented rigid body model to describe the deformation of these continuously deformable structures. Then we're also looking into reduced order finite element methods, where we are not taking a full finite element method, but we are then reducing its order to still capture the main modes of deformation. I will not be speaking about this today. And then the 4th method, which I will also be presenting today, is the deep stochastic Koopman operator, which is a method that allows us to learn the dynamics of our system in a way that it's a bit easier to understand what this black box model is learning, and then applying it to control approaches that work on a lifted Koopman space. So let's start off with this problem of the fish again. So I was saying to you, we were using this manual design fish robot. And the big challenge with this man designed fish robot is that, well, we do not quite yet know what shape we should be taking to get better performance and what controls we should be applying to a structure if we have more chambers that we can control individually in the soft actuator. So what we're saying is, well, let's say we have inspiration from nature. We have all these different shapes and designs of fish that we could be taking. And now let's take those designs and let's say we span the whole design spectrum. We start off with an unoptimized design and we end up with an optimized design for a particular task. That's the pipeline that we are basically proposing in our work and saying, hey, this is how you could be starting off with this model and you end up with an optimized model that's somewhere a hybrid between this design space. So let's say you initialize the weights of all of these designs with this level, and after our optimization, you come out with this final, this is a radar chart that you're seeing here, with this final sets of weights that how much this particular different swimmer is part of the final design. So here's a visualization of this. So you say you have 3 different designs you start off with, and this is how it would look like if you were to interpolate between those different designs. So you see I'm going in the interpolation space, I'm changing between 2 different ray type structures to a normal fish, and that's how the muscles are allocated within the structure. And now we are taking this design, and this is our design space, it's parameterized, and then we are running this into a controller. Our controller is not able to either run, we have 2 different control approaches, we either run a sinusoidal control approach or a fully connected neural network that allows us to send command signals to the individual muscles. And with this, we can then control the fish and tell it, please go forward, please go left, go right, and do a swimming task that we are defining. And in the end, we come up with a loss. And that loss then says, okay, this is our final loss. This is where we are trying to optimize for, let's say, fast forward swimming, and it's able to do that fast forward swimming and it's capable of achieving a better forward performance. So let's say you start off with this initial guess up top, and in the end, you come up with this optimized shark design that came out of this interpolated space of designs. While we haven't optimized for the control, we only optimized for the shape. But we could also similarly do, for example, comparing, taking the 3 initial shapes, which are the baseline shapes up here in red, green, and blue. And in the end, we come up with this optimized hybrid swimmer design that's where we're able to come up basically with both an optimized design, but also an optimized control policy that's acting onto the muscles that we distribute in the structure. So in the next slide, you see how the muscles actually are actuating. You see how there's a traveling wave going through the muscles of the structure, causing the swimmer to get further in the same units of time. So all top swimmers, all the 3 top swimmers on the top, they're not as fast as the one on the bottom. And then the events, when you look at this, we are basically doing a multi-objective optimization here. We are co-optimizing for multiple objectives. We're not just wanting to have a fast swimmer, but we also want to have, for example, better efficiency, meaning less energy usage of these artificial muscles. So on the top, you see this trade-off space starting off with a high-speed swimmer that is not very efficient. And then you're working your way down to medium speeds, to the medium efficiency, and down to a high efficiency swimmer. And this is basically our Pareto front that we are traveling along. You see it with these white and these colored dots along all of the different designs that we were basically generating in our approach. And the nice thing about our approach is because it's a fully differentiable pipeline, we can just step with gradient descent through this pipeline and optimize it. So then we tried this out and we actually took this to a real life application. And we said, hey, let's try this out. And we see, hey, we can actually also replicate this in an actual fish robot that we're building and trying it out on. Then we combine this with a thrust measurement unit, and we can see how well does this work. So our simulation then has to also account for the buckling effects of our tail. So when you're deforming the tail, you're seeing you're not having just floating on the left side, but you also have buckling on the right side. And we also have to look into how to predict the thrust forces that are caused by hydrodynamic interactions. So we then ran a couple of different experiments where we built various designs of these fishtails and we tracked those designs, and then that gave us the ability to look at, okay, how do we do a sim to real transfer between our simulation to our real designs while trying to be as accurate as possible. In the end, we could identify the material parameters of the bodies and the spines, Young's modulus, and the Poisson ratio with our approach in just a few steps of iterations, which other methods wouldn't allow you to do as easily. So with this is one way we have tried this basically on fishtails, but we've also been interested to apply this to other structures. So we've also just recently published this work on sim-to-real for this differentiable FEM. But in this case, we've tried it also on robotic arms, on cantilever beams, and other soft deformable structures, not just a fishtail. And in this work, we are describing the three, as we see it, the three major recipes that you need to follow to get the FEM to match the reality, which were related to the meshing approaches, to the damping of the structure, and through the actuation mapping. So to give you an example here, is we started off with looking at these structures that are made of various meshing approaches. So we looked at tetrahedral and hexagonal approaches to meshing our structures. And then we were looking into, do we get certain nonlinear effects just through the choices of meshing that we would like to avoid? The other problem was that we would get numerical damping in our structure that is just because of using a fast implicit Newton-Euler method. And the third thing that we had is, how do you deal with the high dimensional model that we are facing here? And how do you still get a low dimensional model that's still somewhat accurate and still can describe the actuation? So these three things we were looking into and trying to match it with real examples. So for the meshing example, we looked into how does hexahedral meshes versus tetrahedral meshes and COMSOL as our baseline and real data from a real robot compare to each other. And we then were able to derive what you need to do to get your simulation to properly do a sim-to-real transfer. Then we also looked at the damping behaviors between the COMSOL proprietary solver, our projective dynamics approach. And then we looked at how can we tune the damping so it's actually correct damping as the system does and not a numerical damping effect. So we introduced an additional damping effect that allows you to now match it to the real damping in the real system. And then in the end, we postulated an actuation model that works as a surrogate to the real actuation chambers, because the typical actuation chambers in these soft arms are these cavity structures, which require high fidelity FEM meshes. But if you want to run this here in a reasonable time frame and want to optimize our structures, you need to have an actuation method that models these muscles somewhat realistically while still being computationally tracked. So those were the three insights from this work. And so please check it out if you're interested to see if that could help you for your modeling challenges. So now I want to give you a little bit of an idea of how we are then applying these modeling methods to also robotic control, for example, for the soft robotic arm. And here we are, for example, looking at this first principle, going back to the slide, is this minimal parameter model. So we are using the minimal parameter model to explain the dynamics of our structure. And it basically helps us to learn from the classical rigid robot literature and apply this literature to the real robots by saying we can approximate the real soft robot with an articulated rigid robot model and basically use this discretized world and still somewhat get reasonable dynamic assumptions. And without going into detail, which I don't have time for today, but you should check out our works on this, we then not only develop these models, but we also build multiple 3D soft arms that are using these analytical models. And these analytical models allow us to describe the full dynamics of the arm and then use it for proprioceptive measurements and also to estimate how much is our arm picking up as the various types of objects that could be picked with it. The other thing we did is we integrate into our arm a proprioceptive sensor that has ability to measure flex of the arm. And that allowed us to then also reconstruct the motions of the arm, but not without having to use any more motion capture systems that are tracking the points of the arm, but we can use the interior proprioceptive sensing nodes instead. So that will help us to use these arms outside of a motion capture rig. And then what I was just mentioning is we could then use it to reconstruct the shape of the arm without any external cameras. And we're combining basically both our dynamic model and the sensors here together to do this reconstruction. And we are also using it to do force estimation. So we can estimate how much force is acting on our structure as a human is pulling on the arm. So with this, we then went a step further and said, well, why don't we take this arm and apply operational space control to it? And particularly we use potential fields. And so we were then saying, okay, we're gonna use potential fields to say we can actually move this arm through a range of obstacles by using a well-known technique from rigid robots and use this for force control on our soft robot. with this, we were able to do things like drawing on a wall or throwing objects or going through obstacles. And it allowed us to detail evaluations of using various objects that we are manipulating with our arm. We put a gripper on the arm to actually manipulate objects with it. And we then also did throwing tests with the arm. And we also did pick and place motions with the soft arm. So this is a completely soft arm, and we applied this operational space control framework. And based on this, we also have tried out a few other approaches. I know I'm running short on time, but I want to cover two more things. So one aspect is what we looked at is we used adaptive control approaches that let us learn the model adaptively on the fly. So this was another paper that we are going to be presenting at ICRA this year, where we are comparing baseline control approaches that have fairly low capabilities of running dynamic controls, and we compare that to an adaptive control approach. So in our case, we can now, let me show you this, we can now take also loads onto the arm and account for those loads and still do fairly accurate tracking of, let's say, a star trajectory and other trajectories in real time without having accounted for these objects beforehand. So with an adaptive control approach, we can now do control of even under uncertainty that we were not able to do before. Another thing that is also interesting to us is to take our soft robotic arm and bring it onto a drone, because we want to show that we can control this arm even when the base of the arm is free floating. So we then basically took our soft robotic arm and said, we are putting this onto a drone, and we started off designing a control for this in simulation. And we were able to show, and this is going to be presented here at RoboSoft, that we can make a system that is capable of having the soft arm on it, and we can still control it in operational space and have, for example, follow trajectories, deal with disturbances, and also fly around in space. And so, for example, tracking here a circular trajectory while the arm continuously is following the tracking points while the drone is flying around. So we're using this omnidirectional drone, and we're using a soft arm that we are modeling on the bottom of it. Another idea that we had is we could also say we are making our wings of our drone soft. And this is what we did in this work here, where we say we have a multi-rotor setup. We have multiple rotors combined onto these 6 arms, and 3 of those arms are soft and 3 of those arms are rigid. So we came up with this drone we call S'mores, and this is also going to be presented here at ICRA, where we basically describing that we have the ability to control the softness or the articulation of those 3 thruster arms, plus we can also use thruster forces on it. So you see this system in action. You can see we can now use it to actually do a bimodal flight and hopping with the setup. So the thing can hop off of the ground and go around the path and also fly at the same time. So far, we've only tried this in simulation. So, well, this is just an idea so far that we validated in simulation. And we are now obviously trying to build this system as well. Another thing that we can do with this is we can use these 3 arms to also do grasping maneuvers. So, and here is our first test of using a thruster on the arm and trying to build this system and seeing how much we can actuate these systems together. So I've showed to you a couple of different approaches. And the last one I want to mention that you should check out is we have developed a framework. We call it DISCO. And DISCO allows us to model, this last one, deep stochastic Kopplung order, allows us to black box model a system where you can track the states of the system and lift them into a higher dimensional space. And then in this higher dimensional space, you can apply control techniques on it that you can typically not apply to these highly nonlinear systems. Because you take a highly nonlinear system, you learn its representation in the higher dimensional space, then it becomes a high dimensional linear system, and then you can apply probabilistic state transitions in that high dimensional space to the ends, then map it back to the space that you're controlling in. So with this approach, we were able to control various sets of systems, such as a card pull. We even took a network of genomes and also controlled this network. We applied it to a soft robotic arm, and we also applied it to a half cheetah. And so this work is presented this year at ICLEAR, the Conference on Machine Learning, on learning representations. You should check out our paper on this if you are curious of using this more black box model. And we were able to do more robust control with this setup. So with this, I was able to tell you all about the recent works in my group. And I want to say thanks to my team that has been incredibly inspiring for all of this work. here I'm showing you the different parts of my group that have been focusing on the various aspects of what I was showing you today. And I also want to thank my collaborators that I've been working with on these different areas that I've touched on. Some of them I've touched on. And with this is my overview slide, and now I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Is there any question?
Hi, really cool talk. I had a question about your fish robot. When you let it go through the water, did you have any marine scientists look at it? And have you looked at the video for like fish surveys? Sorry, not a robotic person, more of a marine science person asking this question.
It's a very good question. So for these experiments, we started off with the notion of we want to show that we can bring a fish and a soft robotic fish into the ocean. So the published work on this at the moment, the work that we're working on is not published yet, but this work that is published here, what I'm showing to you, in that case, we had not a marine biologist look at it deeper, because what we did here, we want to just show that we can approach these with this modality. We want to show that we can build this modality, and that we can control this modality and get up close to marine life. We were able to film marine life, but in that work, we were not yet making any statements about marine life in terms of how does it behave differently in regards to our fish. And this is also outside of the field of my competence and my co-workers at the time that worked on this. We primarily wanted to use this and show that soft robots can actually be deployed in the wild and could be used for this. Since I published this work, there were a lot of different interested collaborators and some ongoing now follow-up collaborations that work on this question that you were just asking about.
Very cool, thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Any other question?
Thank you, Professor. So about the arm and in general, so for single actuators, it actually provides many advantages in terms of being low cost and lightweight and such on. One thing that comes into mind, it also restricts the degrees of freedom. So how's the arm moving in multiple directions in going back and forth in a certain plane? And is there a way, for example, for certain objects, maybe non-convex, that the gripper wouldn't be able to hold? Is there a way to move around such thing?
So if I understand your question correctly, so on the one side, you're curious about how well can the arm move into various shapes and various spaces, and then how well can it grasp various objects. So the focus for the work that I showed you was all about the arm movement. It wasn't so much about the versatility of this particular choice of gripper. So when we're talking about the system down here on the right. So with the system down here on the right, we can actually move it into all parts and all ranges of what this arm can reach with its two arm segments. So it can, because it has 3 actuators per segments, we can actually track multiple trajectories. So I was trying to show this here briefly. So we can track, for example, a circular motion. So we can follow a circular path. We can also follow this star path. So we're walking along, moving along a star. And so there's various sets of motions we can move. They are limited by the reachable workspace of the arm, but we can actuate all 3 chambers per segment, and that allows us to do these motions. So we have now recently worked on another work that we just recently submitted on this topic, where we put an additional degree of freedom into arm to reach a larger workspace in the axis of the arm. So like when you see the arm is hanging downwards, and so that's axis, we can also reach no more objects. So we can actually pick out from one and place the other, but that's unpublished work, so I didn't show that yet here today. And in terms of grasper, so this is the 2-finger gripper. So we can only grip objects that come into the right location of the gripper. So you could either come up with a more universal gripping approach, there could be a jamming gripper, or you could have more fingers, or you could be able, as a modality that allows you to rotate the gripper, so when it goes to a certain place, it picks from there. We haven't investigated this part further yet.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.